Good afternoon. This is part 1B of my American History series, first part having to do with Lincoln in his own words. I'm having some trouble trying to figure out exactly how to use this system. In any event, uh, by the time you got through part 1A, if you watched it all or watched any of it, you're probably saying, well, didn't the South or didn't the Confederacy start the Civil War? And I think there's some things that get left out of history. One of the most interesting things that I discovered when I reached my late date, long after I'd finished high school and college history lessons, was that at the famous Battle of Fort Sumter, at that time, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas were still in the Union. They had not seceded, and that small fact is not spread around by many history teachers. And the common story is, hey, the South seceded. They started the war by attacking Fort Sumter. Boom, 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 and everything that happened after that they deserved and they got. That's not really true. And so we're going to go into some of that history here. So here we go. So what do you know about Fort Sumter? When South Carolina formally seceded in December 1860, they immediately took over federal activities in the state. In most cases, the federal employees were happy to comply, but there was a detachment of field artillery, federal field artillery, at a fort overlooking Charleston Harbor that became an issue. South Carolina basically assumed that they would haul down the U.S. flag and be escorted to the United States, but they refused. That's kind of interesting. A discussion between South Carolina representatives, that is, the Confederacy did not exist at that time, and the lame duck president of the United States, Buchanan, resulted in a handshake agreement that South Carolina would not do anything about this detachment as long as they caused no trouble and were not resupplied or reinforced by the USA, that would be the United States, the federal government. This agreement was widely understood but never put into writing. Okay, it was understood by the Confederates, it was understood by the Federals, the military throughout, and also the general population. Now, as I discussed earlier, a discussion or uh, a committee was sent to Washington, D.C. to start trying to get some sort of a peaceful settlement, peaceful discussion about how this whole thing should work. And they were basically stonewalled by the Lincoln administration. Now, at this time, Sumter was under construction. Fort Sumter was actually not completed. It was on an island in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And most American ports had similar forts. New York had a number of forts. Other places had forts. We'll hear about Fort Pickens in, I guess it's Pensacola, Florida. That's going to come up shortly. And there was, basically nobody at Fort Sumter. There was some construction workers and some, I think it was a caretaker type operation. So, on a dark evening in late December, the U.S. detachment secretly left the original fort and relocated to Fort Sumter. Okay, you don't hear that one very often. It is relevant that when this action happened, the U.S. detachment was prepared to fire on South Carolina patrol boats and actually spiked the cannons and burned the carriages supporting the guns at the mainland fort. That is, they were at this fort that was on the mainland shore. They secretly assembled, went across to the fort in the middle of the harbor, which was a more defensible position. When they left, they destroyed their cannons, burned the carriages, And they assumed that the South Carolinians would be all up in arms immediately about this. The South Carolinians didn't even realize that they left until they saw the smoke rising from the burning uh, cannon carriages. And that didn't happen until the next day. Actually, they slipped across to the Fort Sumter, and then it's like nothing's happening. And so they actually went back the next day, grabbed some more stuff, took it back to the Fort Sumter, and also that's when they did their major damage to the remaining fort, which sort of gives a lie to the fact that, hey, the Southerners were destroying federal property and stuff. But anyway, so this act tended to focus the attention of South Carolina, the South Carolinians, on Fort Sumter. Now, ooh, that's interesting. I've got two of these things here. I don't know if that's going to happen throughout. Ignore the blue circle in the upper left-hand corner. Okay, the Star of the West. This is an interesting little episode. The United States government hired a ship called the Star of the West to resupply Fort Sumter, which it attempted to do on January 9th, 1861. It approached the fort from, across the bar at the Charleston Harbor. And interestingly enough, a battery of antique artillery from the Revolutionary War over at the Citadel was manned by some cadets at the Citadel. The Citadel being a military college in South Carolina. And they actually managed to shoot and hit this ship a couple of times. They did no real damage. The artillery was, at the range they were firing, the artillery did no damage to the ship. But the ship, being a civilian ship, turned around and left. And so that episode occurred. Sometimes people focus on this as being the start of the war of what's called the Civil War. Now, so what was Lincoln doing in the December of 1860? Remember, he was not president. He had been elected in November of 1860. South Carolina had seceded in December of 1860. That would be December 20th of 1860. And Lincoln immediately began plotting to bring the seceded states back into the Union by force. No matter what they did, Lincoln was already thinking about using force to bring it back. And Lincoln wasn't even the president this time. Now, he realized that the federal forts and most of the harbors would provide the excuse he needed to use force against the wayward states. Remember, Lincoln thought that the Union was perfect and indivisible. That's been incorporated into our Pledge of Allegiance now, which is a post-Civil War document. Thus, he used his political network to confidentially inform the commanding general of the U.S. military, General Scott, to prepare to take the forts back. This is, for example, December 21st, 1860. He actually had two letters sent by political operatives. I've got them. The complete documents are here on the left, on the bottom. These actually came out of the Lincoln documents, Lincoln archives. And the first one, this is to Francis P. Blair, Sr. And it says, "My dear sir, yours giving an account of an interview with General Scott is received and for which I thank you. According to my present view, if the forts shall be given up before the inauguration, the general must retake them afterwards. Yours truly, A. Lincoln." And the other one is to Elihu B. Washburn, and it says, "My dear sir, last night I received your letter giving an account of your interview with General Scott, for which I thank you. Please present my respects to the general and tell him confidentially I shall be obliged to him to be as well prepared as he can be to either hold or retake the forts as the case may require at and after the inauguration. Yours as ever, A. Lincoln." Okay, so Lincoln was right after South Carolina had seceded, Lincoln is immediately thinking in terms of retaking these forts. At this time, the detachment had not moved to the fort, or they were about to move to the fort, but it all happened within about a week. All right, now into this mix comes an interesting person that you've probably never heard of, Gustavus V. Fox. And this is Lincoln's plot to get the Confederacy to fire the first shot. If you think I'm making this up, you need to read the documents that's highlighted here in blue. Okay, the document there is the letters and correspondence of Mr. Fox from this time frame. Now, Fox appears to be a very high ego guy. He's got a real thing going for him. He was a former Navy person, and he suddenly had an idea how he could retake the forts, or at least resupply those forts. Now, knowing that South Carolina followed by the Confederacy, now this is unwinding in 1861 as the other states seceded from the U.S. government. He had declared that they would not take action against Fort Sumter unless the U.S. attempted to resupply or reinforce it. Lincoln had the perfect trigger to get the Confederacy to fire the first shot, thereby freeing him, at least in the mind of Northerners, to use indiscriminate force to bring the seceded states back into the Union. Remember, at this time, there was only 7 Confederate states. They were very weak, had very small populations, and it would have been a walkover to invade them, take them over, and do whatever you wanted to do with them. The plausibility of this is tied to the fact that at the time, the Confederacy consisted of only 7 weak states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And when you say Texas, you're really talking about East Texas. At this time, the following states were still in the Union. This is Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. We will see the importance of Virginia and North Carolina in a few minutes. Proof that Lincoln's plan had nothing to do with slavery. March 4th, 1861. The primary relief that Confederate states wanted was a freedom from tariffs. I mentioned that in the discussion of Stevens back in the part 1 of this, part 1A of this. Secondarily, they were concerned about the harassment by abolitionists. Freeing 4 million slaves would potentially wreck the economy of the South and pose severe social change that could include a revolt of freed slaves against the Europeans. Secession solved both of these problems for the South. In the first inaugural address, Lincoln, consistent with his views on race, which we talked about in Part 1A, tried to address the slavery issue in a way which would be acceptable to his Midwestern constituents. Now, these are quotes from the first inaugural address. It's readily available online. Go look it up, find it. Lincoln, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Now, he goes further into this. And there was, at this time, remember, most of the Southern congressmen and senators had left. That would be the original 7 states. Congress was trying to solve this problem itself. And it had passed. This was presumably before Lincoln was president. They had passed an amendment, something called the Corn Amendment. This amendment basically held that slavery could never be ended. It was going to be a perpetual thing in the states where it existed. So here's what Lincoln said. This is fairly late in the inaugural address. You have to read down through it a while. He says, "I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, however, I have not seen, has passed Congress, to the effect that the federal government shall never, interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service. To avoid misconstruction of what I have said, I depart from my purpose not to speak of particular amendments so far as to say that, holding such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. In other words, Lincoln is saying in his inaugural address, not only that he has no constitutional power or inclination, that would be personal inclination or constitutional power, to end slavery in the states where it existed, and he also has support for a amendment to the Constitution which would make slavery in those states irrevocable and perpetual. Now, if the South were going to, if the Confederacy at that time, 7 states, were revolting or seceding over the issue of slavery, they've won. Lincoln is basically saying slavery is off the table. You got it. We're not going to change your situation. The problem is that was not why the South was seceding. It was a matter of economics, and even a little higher level, it was an issue of who was going to control the federal government. Okay, this goes all the way back to the forming of the Constitution. You know, people tend to mock the South because of the, I guess it was the fact that black people were not counted as population for representation as highly as white people. That was built into the Constitution, and the point that should be made is that the South would have been happy to have black people counted as a full person. It was the northern states that did not have slave populations who wanted to have more power in the federal government, and they are the ones who wanted the black people, the slaves in the South, to not. This would be, there was a lot of freed slaves, former slaves in the South at this time as well, and they wanted those people not to be considered in this, when apportioning legislative seats and things like that. So, you know, it's interesting how facts gets twisted around to represent something that actually the reverse of what they were intended. Now, if the secession of the states had been mainly slavery, Lincoln's words would have ended the secession right there. They had won. The real basis of secession was economic and direct and indirect effects of the bullying of the New England states, reinforced by the Midwestern and Far Western states that wanted to remain slave-free. Slave-free. They didn't want black people in those states because they did not want free or enslaved black Africans for the same reason that they were killing off the Native Americans and virtually enslaving the Asian immigrants. In 1846, John C. Fremont ultimately became a fairly radical abolitionist. At least he was viewed that way by a lot of people in politics. In 1846, John C. Fremont led a massacre of up to 900 Wintu people, those were Native Americans, on the banks of the Sacramento River. Okay, he was basically he didn't have any problem at all killing off Native Americans, but then he wrapped himself in the mantle of being a pro abolitionist. Okay, back to Fox. G.V. Fox was a former Navy man with immense ego. He approached the Lincoln administration early in 1861 with a plan to reinforce Fort Sumter from the sea using several large ships and a number of smaller ships, actually similar to the invasion of Veracruz during the Mexican War. That was 1847. So this was not quite as original as Fox would have you believe, because Scott had already done it in the Mexican War. But it's basically a motherships launching small vessels to reinforce Fort Sumter. This plan went through various details while Lincoln awaited his inauguration, which happened on March 4th, 1861. Ultimately, the plan morphed into a two-pronged simultaneous attack, one on Fort Sumter and an occupation of Fort Pickens in Pensacola Bay, Florida. In the meantime, the federal garrison at Fort Sumter was told to hold out as long as possible and were allowed by the Confederates to receive unopened mail and visitors. I mean, the South was not persecuting these folks at Fort Sumter. They just were trying to get them to move out. And they knew that they were being allowed to get provisions and ammunition and stuff like that, that is not consistent with the idea that they're going to move out. And so they're basically saying, you've got what you've got. When you get hungry, it's to be time to go. And so the Fox is figuring out how to reinforce them and resupply them. Now, this is a letter from Fox to his wife. Now, this whole plan to deal with Fort Sumter was very, it had a lot of moving parts, and it tended to get bogged down, and ultimately looked like it was not going to move ahead as fast as the attack on Fort Pickens. So on March 19th, 1861, Fox wrote a letter to his wife, and this was shortly after, this was like 2 weeks after Lincoln was inaugurated. Dear V, I think his wife's name was Victoria or Vicky or something like that. Our Uncle Abe Lincoln has taken high esteem for me and wishes me to take dispatches to Major Anderson at Fort Sumter with regard to its final evacuation and to obtain a clear statement of his conditions, which his letters probably guarded do not fully exhibit. Okay, so he's going to literally, the South is actually letting Fox go to the fort, talk to the people there. Fox says we get letters from Anderson, that's the commander of the federal detachment there, but they may be guarded because they may be concerned that the Southerners are reading his mail. They were not. And I have really great curiosity to see the famous fort, and several of my naval intimates are there in command. Governor Pickens may turn me back, but I think not. I'll leave this evening and ought to be returned here Sunday and New York Thursday or Wednesday. Minma thinks I am going to New York and knows nothing of my visit here. Though very inquisitive, be careful in all your letters. Write me Friday or Saturday and tell me how you are and all about Doctor and where you are. Affectionately, Gustavus. So this is a letter that's included in his collected letters published on the internet. He says, I'm going down to Fort Sumter. He's really down there to spy on the situation. He's going down there nominally under the pretext of visiting an old friend, but he's already got this plan going, and he just really wants to see how things are. He really wants to know how long can they hold out, and are the parameters I'm working into my plan, are they correct? All right. It all came down to April 12th. The federal garrison was about to be forced, for lack of food, to surrender. Only the fort. They weren't surrendering the troops. They were only surrendering the fort. The federal soldiers, with their personal weapons, were welcome to leave to the United States. At one point, Fox was greatly dismayed because Sumter's action force was being delayed, and it appeared that the force attacking Fort Pickens would actually start the war. He knew that this was going to start a war because that's what the Southerners had said. Hey, if you try to reinforce these forts or take these forts, we're going to resist that. Now, this is a quote from Fox to a friend, and this is sort of a smoking gun in my opinion. This is from the Fox documents, which were published, I guess they were assembled in 1918, and this is on page 9 of those documents that are on the internet. G.V. Fox to Dr. Lowry, April 3rd, 1861. My expedition is ordered to be got ready, but I doubt if we shall get off. Delay, indecision, and obstacles. Basically, he's very frustrated with the bureaucracy dealing with this. War will commence in Pensacola. Now, why in the hell would he say that? War will commence in Pensacola. So he knew that there was going to be a war. He knew it was going to happen as a result of attacking the forts. And he thought, oh my God, I'm not going to be the guy that gets to do it up at Fort Sumter. There's guys that are going to Pensacola are going to get ahead of me, and they're going to start the war. There, the government is making a stand, and if they fire upon reinforcements already ordered to land, Fort Pickens and the ships will open upon the whole party. In other words, there's a detachment of ships and Marines down to Pensacola, and that group is ahead of his group headed for Fort Sumter. And he is concerned that war will commence in Pensacola, not at Fort Sumter, which is what he is hoping for. We'll leave here tomorrow afternoon. Love to all. Truly, G.V. Fox. Now, we're going to see this point later again from other sources, but this, in my view, is sort of a smoking gun. All right, now the commanding officer seen at Pensacola understood the understanding that had been established regarding reinforcements of forts and refused to obey the orders that came down. In other words, the guy who's actually in charge of the harbor has this group of people come down from Washington by ship, and they say, hey, we're going to invade Fort Pickens in Pensacola. And he says, no, I'm not going to let you do that, because there's this agreement that we've been abiding by for about 4 or 5 months now, since December, that as long as we don't try to reinforce it, they're not going to shoot at us. Thus, the Lincoln administration, this is really a wild story. Okay, so when Lincoln found out that people in Pensacola were not going to attack on the date that they were supposed to attack, they actually sent a special messenger by train across the South. It went from Washington, D.C. to Pensacola, Florida, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, etc., down to Florida. And this guy was here again. He actually had a written message, written orders. About halfway down there, he gets nervous, and I think he destroyed the message, but he memorized it. And so he could literally tell the guy in charge down there, hey, the rules have changed. You're going to attack the fort, regardless of what this other agreement was with the Buchanan administration. The Lincoln administration is going to attack this fort and get cracking here. Now, the Confederate officers, realizing that the reinforcing force was assembling outside Charleston Harbor, set a firm deadline for the Federal garrison to agree to surrender the fort on the morning of April 12th. In other words, this delay that happened down at Pensacola allowed the forces headed for Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, to catch up. So both of these things are now basically on the same schedule. The Confederates realized that there was enough information flying back and forth in newspapers, and people were seeing these ships depart and know how long it took them to go from point A to point B, and they could see ships starting to appear outside the Charleston Harbor port. They could see out there, hey, there's some warships out there that look like that this might be the starting of this reinforcement activity. So when they saw that, they said, hey, we have to have a firm date. We're going to tell you, they told the Anderson at Fort Sumter that on the morning of April 12th, they were going to start shooting. Okay. All they had to do was agreed to leave the fort, he could take down his colors, take his men, all their personal weapons, and just leave. Any way they wanted to leave, they could just leave. Just surrender the fort, not your people. Okay, so Anderson is trying to lead the Southerners on. Literally, a couple of officers from the Confederate Army, which the Confederacy now had an army, I guess it's Beauregard was the commanding officer there now. And these guys literally were at the fort they came there twice in the evening, and they were basically being stonewalled by Anderson. Anderson put his people to bed, like go to sleep, nothing you can do, and so at the same time, he was stonewalling the emissaries that were trying to get him to surrender, because he knew that within hours that this relieving force would appear. He had a better view than probably anybody else. He had a higher position and telescopes. He could see these ships coming out there, and he had been told by Fox roughly what was going to happen when Fox had visited the fort. So ultimately, and by the way, the Confederates were unmasking their batteries. They had put a bunch of batteries, artillery facing the fort, and they basically are moving the camouflage, and they're you could see activity on the shore. That they're getting ready to do this, and the emissaries actually left the fort literally about an hour before the bombardment began. I think it was like 6 o'clock in the morning on the 12th. So the bombardment begins. The federal troops very soon respond. Now it's interesting because the federal troops were not only shooting at the artillery, they were shooting at civilians. They were shooting at South Carolina civilians. If you don't believe me, read the memoirs of Doubleday. Okay, he actually says, "Oh, I shot at these guys." But interestingly enough, all this cannon fire went back and forth. The fort caught fire, but nobody was actually killed on either side. There may have been some minor injuries, but they're not recorded in history. The entire episode, the fort caught fire and they decided to surrender it. Literally while the Fox's relieving force was sitting outside the harbor waiting for the tide and wind and everything for them to go in. And nobody was killed or wounded in this action. Now there was, after this was over, after the U.S. detachment struck its colors, sent up the white flag, they were allowed to keep their weapons, their personal weapons, and they were allowed to fire a salute. And while they were firing the salute, one of the guns exploded and killed at least one, maybe two Union soldiers. Otherwise, they were moved off the fort onto the ships that had come to resupply them and reinforce them, and were taken back to, I guess, either New York or Washington, and at which time they became national heroes. They were promoted as national heroes in the North. So that's an interesting phenomenon. It's not the way the story is usually told. Now, Fox, he's not quite the political savvy guy that he thinks he is. He actually thinks he has failed. So the fort was lost. He did not intend to lose the fort. He did not intend for the fort to surrender. That was his job, in his mind, was to prevent the fort from surrendering. And he couldn't understand why Lincoln was happy. And why? Why would Lincoln be happy that the fort had fallen? Okay, this again is from the Fox archives. And Lincoln to Fox, this was on May 1st, 1861. My dear sir, I sincerely regret that the failure of the late attempt to provision Fort Sumter should be the source of any annoyance to you. And he goes through some talk there, and he comes back and he says, and this is the part highlighted below, this is Lincoln talking now. This is not Fox, this is Lincoln. It says, you and I both anticipated that the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter. You'll notice that Lincoln spelled, everybody in the Lincoln administration wrote Sumter as with a P. There's no P in the word. It's Sumter. Okay, Fort Sumter, even if it should fail, and it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation is justified by the result. And the obvious interpretation of this is that Lincoln didn't care if it was successful or if it was unsuccessful, as long as the South fired the first shot, and he could use that as a basis for using force against the Confederacy, which at that time was a very small, weak 7-state unit. I'll read that again. You, that is, say, Fox, and I, Lincoln, both anticipated that the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter, even if it should fail, and it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation is justified by the result. In other words, he got what he wanted. South fired the first shot. Okay, now this is G.B. Fox to his wife a day or so later. I guess this is the 4th of May. And he says, I wrote you yesterday, and today I forwarded. So this is apparently Fox has suddenly got the message. Oh, by the way, it didn't matter whether you won or lost. It just mattered that you played the game. I wrote you yesterday, and today I forward you a copy of the President's letter to me. That was the one we just saw. Now, this is emphasis was not added by me. This is emphasis. The bolded stuff here was emphasized by Fox. Under no circumstances is any mention of it whatever to get into the papers. The whole history of the affair is in able hands, and in due time will appear. And the effect of that coming would be destroyed by any premature notice. In other words, there is political propaganda being stewed up, and he doesn't, he's telling, his wife what's going on, and he doesn't want this leaking out to the press in any form, because the Lincoln administration is going to spin it a specific way. I have no objection to Ms. Whitmore seeing it, as she has somewhat shared our feelings, or your feelings. The President wants me to take a ship in the Navy, but Blair thinks I should go to the Navy Department, especially as a naval war would be only one of blockade. They'd already figured that out. This was going to be a blockade. And so they've already figured that out. This is not something that came up after. They've already planned to blockade the South and to do that. And this was just a way to get that all going. Clearly, Lincoln's own motivation was that the Confederates would fire the first shot and allow him to manipulate public passions in the North, which he did. Now, if you need more proof that Lincoln planned to start the war, Stephen Douglas of the Lincoln-Douglas debates died on June 3rd, 1861, and was replaced by a guy named Orville Browning, who was a friend of Lincoln. Now, Browning met with Lincoln in Washington on July 3rd, 1861, and recorded the following notes in his diary. He, Lincoln, told me that the very first thing placed in his hands after the inauguration was a letter from Major Anderson announcing the impossibility of defending or relieving Sumter. That he called the cabinet together and consulted General Scott. That Scott concurred with Anderson, and that the cabinet, with the exception of himself and Postmaster General Blair, were for evacuating the fort, and that all the troubles and anxieties of his life had not equaled those which intervened between this time and the fall of Sumter. Now remember, this is Lincoln to his friend. He himself conceived the idea and proposed sending supplies without an attempt to reinforce, giving notice of the fact to Governor Pickens of South Carolina. The plan succeeded. They attacked Sumter. It fell, and thus did more service than it otherwise could. Lincoln wanted them to fire on the fort. He was doing everything he could to get them to fire on the fort because he used that for political purposes. Those of you who are baby boomers like me may remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions. You may remember, if you remember your history of the Spanish-American War, may remember the sinking of the Maine. There was also obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor. So it is not unusual for the United States to use some sort of an attack and use that as an excuse to go to war. Now, I think there's dubious questions about what happened with the Maine. There's dubious questions about the Gulf of Tonkin. Pearl Harbor pretty obviously was a systematic attack by the Japanese on American ships. But if you go back and read about that, nobody at that time thought that an air attack would do near the damage that it actually did. Okay. So anyway, Lincoln's secretary, all right, now let's go one more step. This is Lincoln's secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay. This is Nicolay and Hay, Abraham Lincoln, volume 4, page 33 through 42, or 33, 44, and 62. We're also privy to this plot. President Lincoln, in deciding that the Sumter question, had adopted a simple but effective policy. To use his own words, he determined to send bread to Anderson. If the rebels fired on that, they would not be able to convince the world that they had not begun the Civil War. So there you have it. There was a plot by Abraham Lincoln to start the war. And he was happy about it because at that time, the South was the Confederacy was only 7 states. They were very weak. And remember, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas were still in the Union. And if you turn those states themselves against the Southern, the Deep South, the Cotton states, it would have been a no-brainer. And he would have reunified the United States, which is what he wanted to do. Remember, Lincoln was an intelligent and well-meaning, but ignorant of the true relationship of the states and the federal government. He did not anticipate that his call for troops to attack the Confederacy, as it stood on April 12, 1861, would be regarded as unconstitutional and tyrannical by other Southern states. Lincoln was so naive as to offer Robert E. Lee the command of Union forces. That's okay. So Lincoln actually offered Lee of Virginia the office of command of our forces. This is the Executive Department, Richmond. Okay, this is Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War for the United States, sent out a notice to all the states that were still in the Union, saying we need you to come up with some soldiers so that we can go fight a war. Now they didn't make that very explicit, but if you look at they're looking for 75,000 people. Now, there's not nearly the American Army at that time was a small fraction of that, and it was obvious to anybody getting that summons that the purpose here was to go attack the Confederacy. And so here is what you see. This is on the 16th of April, 1861. This is from the John Lecter, who is the governor of Virginia. Upon receiving this, he says to Simon Cameron, he says, "Sir, I received your telegram of the 15th, the genuineness of which I doubted. In other words, this was so off the wall, I didn't think it was real. Since that time, I've received your communication, mailed the same day, in which I am requested to detach from the militia of the state of Virginia, quote, the quota designated in a table which you appended, to serve as infantry or riflemen for a period of 3 months, unless sooner discharged. In reply to this communication, I have only to say that the militia of Virginia will not be furnished to the powers at Washington for any such use or purpose as you have in view. Your objective is to subjugate the southern states, and a requisition made upon me for such an object in my judgment not within the purview of the Constitution or the Act of 1795, will not be complied with. You have chosen to inaugurate civil war, and having done so, we will meet it in a spirit as determined as the administration has exhibited towards the South. Respectfully, John Lecter. So this requisition of troops was actually, I think, the cause of the Civil War as we know it, because at the time before this happened, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas were not in the Confederacy. And they had, this was the motivation thing that caused them to secede from the Union. Now, you may say, was that a big deal? Over the next weeks, Virginia, North Carolina, etc., seceded, and did this matter? Did the war really start without Robert E. Lee, Joseph E. Johnson, Thomas J. Jackson? Okay, those are people, those happen to be from Virginia, who played key roles for the South in the Civil War. Now, if you look at this table, these are the casualties by state for these people. You'll notice that North Carolina and Virginia both lost 31,000 people in the war out of populations of less than 200,000. The percentage of losses on the right is astounding. Remember, this 31,000, that would be 62,000. Vietnam, over 10 years, there was a loss of 58,000, roughly. So North Carolina and Virginia alone in the war between the states, the Civil War, whatever you want to call it, lost more than Vietnam. Okay, we think of Vietnam as being a pretty big deal. Obviously, the population of North Carolina and Virginia was much smaller then than it was during the 1960s. The 1860s, they were small states in terms of population. Even Arkansas, Tennessee, etc., had substantial casualties. And if you look at North Carolina and Virginia compared to Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, you'll see that the North Carolina and Virginia really carried the burden of this war. And it didn't, they were not involved at the time of Fort Sumter. So don't blame them for Fort Sumter. Now, a few facts about slavery. The international slave trade was one of the main sources of wealth among leading New England families. Most of the slaves were male, and most of them were delivered to sugar plantations on Hispaniola, that's Haiti and Dominican Republic, Cuba and Jamaica, and other islands where they typically died within 10 years and had to be replaced. The slaves were just basically consumable products on these islands. These islands were monocrop. There was they grew sugar. Sugar grew 365 every day of the year. You're out there growing, cutting sugarcane. This is a job for strong men. You don't need women to do that. Trying to cut cane and carry it back to the press, and then pressing it, and then doing all that. This is not woman's work. These islands basically did nothing but grow sugarcane. They did not grow food crops. So the New Englanders also provided these islands with food and building materials, and anything else that got manufactured or was needed was sent there. The slaves came from Africa on ships that were owned, crewed, commanded, and shared profits with New Englanders. Okay, not the Southerners. Southerners didn't have any ships, didn't have a navy. They were embargoed in the war. So the New Englanders also used their ships to deliver food, wood, etc. Despite this being officially outlawed in 1807, slave ships were still departing New York City in 1860. If you go look up, there's actually newspaper articles about the last slave ship, and probably the only captain who was actually convicted of slave trading and executed. In contrast to the hellish life of African slaves on the islands, where they were mainly it was a bunch of guys that were taken there and allowed to die from exhaustion, overwork, etc. Relatively small numbers, only about 500,000 in total. Males and females were brought to the U.S. mainland, where the farms were diversified and farming was seasonal. Even in South Carolina, you have a seasonality to things. You plant in the spring, raise crops in the summer, harvest in the fall, and then the wintertime you go out and do something. You go hunting or repair your equipment, whatever it is. But there's a seasonality to this thing. It's not the same thing every day. And as a result, women are useful because they can do a lot of these jobs, and things like taking the seeds out of cotton, for example. And basically, so you ended up with a completely different demographics among the slaves in the United States, the mainland. You had slave families, and it turned out that the slaves in the South were doubling in population every 25 years. They were having large families, and the people were surviving, and the number of slaves was increasing. By 1860, you had about 4 million slaves, mostly in the South, and by 1860, there were 500,000 freed slaves in the United States, half of which were in the South, and they did not go north when the war started. They did not say, "Hey, I'm free. I'm going to New York." They said, basically, the only reason to leave the South was to escape slavery. If you happen to have a bad master or some other reason drove you to it. So, although the arrival of slave children was initially viewed as an economic benefit, in actual fact, the growing population of slaves was only useful as long as there was adequate land to utilize their labor. Over the 1800s, the demographics of the slave population included many retired slaves and many slave children, and a core of slaves, male and female, who were actually economically productive. So basically what's happening is when slavery started on the mainland, it had a young, strong, healthy group of people who were enslaved. And those people were productive. But as soon as you started putting children into this mix, and as soon as the slaves did not die, they retired. They were with the family for 30, 40 years, and then they retired. It's like, they didn't, we didn't kill slaves. They retired, and then they were not productive. And so in order to have the slaves productive, you have to have land. And what happened to South Carolina was, if you start here in 1890 and you go forward to about 1830 here, what you find is that South Carolina was, as I said earlier in this process, they had a abundance of slave labor, but a lot of it was unemployed because it was children or retired people. And at the same time, they ran out of land. That dotted line represents the availability of land for farming. And actually, the productivity of the land was declining constantly because of the nutrients were not being replaced. All right. So in 1830, this time period where you see the upslant of the dotted line, the the land was, the Native Americans were displaced from North Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and that created a new open land, and so there was new need for slave labor. And so during that period of time, those people who were the residents of Arkansas, Tennessee, the western states, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc. They were pretty comfortable because they had land, they needed slaves. This is when the slaves were sold down the river from the northeast into the south. But when you get to 1860, the population of slaves keeps increasing almost exponentially, but we run out of land. And now if you look at the top of this thing, the return on investment for slaving, the use of slave labor, declines. It declines because you end up with more and more unemployed slaves. And when you run out of land, you don't need any more slaves. But the population of slaves keeps increasing. And so slavery by 1860 was a break-even game. And if you had gone ahead another 30 years, another generation, it would have doubled again. And at that point, it would have been totally unprofitable. It's very interesting that by 1870, the war was devastating to the infrastructure and the governments of the South. And yet by 1870, with the slaves, no longer slaves, they were freed, there was actually more production in cotton, or virtually the same production in cotton, as had been in 1860, because free labor was actually more efficient than slave labor. And obviously profitability, if you hire people, you can fire them if you don't have work. You can't fire the slaves. Didn't get fired, they just didn't have work. They were sent to do menial jobs. So the whole process of economics of slavery was not sustainable in the South. It was sustainable on the islands because the slaves died and they did not reproduce. In the American mainland, the South, the Cotton States, and the other states in the South, the slaves multiplied. The rate of increase in population of the slaves, of black people in Africa, freed, was slower, even today, than it was amongst the slaves in North America. So look at the rate of population increase in the slaves, and look at the rate of population increase among the native Africans that were not enslaved, and you'll find that slaves were, if you want to look at it ecologically, they must have been doing fairly well because their population kept increasing. All right, we're going to go on to part C. This is going to be relatively brief. This is Lincoln in his own words, part 3. And we're going to go in particular, it says, if you watched parts A and parts B, which I hope you did, you will have discovered that Lincoln was like almost all Europeans of his time. They were racist and they were white supremacists. In addition, his main concern was saving the Union as he assumed it had intended to be. Thus, he engineered the conflict at Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens to motivate his Midwestern and Far Western constituencies who viewed the consolidated federal territories as lands to be reserved for white Europeans, and once the Native Americans were exterminated or corralled, and the Northeastern industrialists and abolitionists who were eager to trade rights of way through the federal territories for a transcontinental railroad and maximize their profits with a protective tariff, and sue the guilt-ridden abolitionists, that is to say, descendants of the international slave traders of New England who had bought millions of Africans to the sugar plantations of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Jamaica, where they were worked to death. The image that the northern slave owners or slave traders, the descendants of them had, was that the slaves were just condemned to die, because that's where their forefathers had taken them to these islands basically to die. That was not what was happening in the South. And so I think there was a guilt-ridden class of people in the Northeast who probably had moneyed families that had been participant in the slave trade. You don't hear about the slave traders of the Northeast today. They have just about completely eradicated it from their history. They don't talk about slave trading. They don't talk about how the money got made, all that sort of thing. There's a small revivalist historians group that is looking at that. There's been a couple of books published, I think one was called Complicity, basically saying, hey, we were up here in the North and we were complicit in the slavery. Well, not only were you complicit, you actually created it and started it and proceeded to it. And you not only were complicit in the South, your main focus was on the islands of the Caribbean and Atlantic, where they were just basically dying by droves. Millions of slaves were transported from Africa to these islands and to South America, where they died for the most part. The ones that made it to the United States, the mainland, were the lucky ones. So anyway, now unlike the situation in 1832, when Andrew Jackson told Congress, asked Congress for permission to do something or use force against South Carolina to counter the nullification of the tariff of 1832. In 1861, the Congress, what was left of it, that is to say, the states that were still in the Union, just went out of session for about 6 months. Lincoln and his cabinet did what they wanted to do, whatever that was, for that time period. From April 12th to July 4th, Congress was not in session. That was 1861. They came back in session July 4th through August 6th, just long enough to pass a new tax structure and retroactively approve Lincoln's actions, which included the loss of habeas corpus. You could throw people in jail if they didn't agree with you. Then Congress went out of session until December 2nd, 1861. During that whole period of the fall of 1861, Lincoln was virtually a dictator, and from his inauguration until December 2nd, 1861. Okay. Now, in August 1862, this was a year and 3 or 4 months after the war had nominally started, Lincoln gathered together some freedmen in Washington, D.C., and he was trying to sell an idea to them. He was trying to sell the idea to them of leaving the country. This was, if you go back to his Lincoln-Douglas debates, this is the same idea he had in 1858. This is 4 years later. He's got the same idea. He doesn't like black people in the United States. He's agnostic about slavery. He doesn't care if it exists in some states. He feels that he can't do anything about it. But he'd really like the black people to leave. And this is still his idea. So you can read this whole document. It's out there on the internet. And these are quotes from Abraham Lincoln. And he says that he's talking to these freedmen. And it says, but for your race among us, there could not be war, although many men engaged on either side do not care for you one way or the other. Nevertheless, I repeat, without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have an existence. It is better for us both, therefore, to be separated. Okay, so Lincoln is a racist. He's a white supremacist. He's a segregationist. Okay, and let's move on here. He comes down through here. He says the question is, if the colored people are persuaded to go anywhere, why not there? Okay, he's talking about places that black people could be deported to. And his new idea is to send them to Panama instead of Liberia. The place I'm thinking about, having for a colony is in Central America. It is nearer to us than Liberia. Not much more than 1/4 as far as Liberia and within 7 days run by steamers. So he's basically trying to convince these guys, like, if you will move to Panama, we'll all be happy. You'll be happy, we'll be happy, and we'll be free of you. That's, he's not only is he a racist, a segregationist, a white supremacist, he's also a white nationalist because he wants black people out of the United States. That's your Abraham Lincoln. Okay, now shortly thereafter, August 2nd, 22nd, 1862, Horace Greeley, who was an abolitionist, ran a newspaper. Suddenly, like, what's going on with Lincoln? Why is he, not beating the abolitionist drum harder? And so he wrote an article which Lincoln decided to respond to. Lincoln, this is his letter, the entirety of his letter to Horace Greeley, which was published in the newspaper. And I'll read you the second paragraph there. It says, this is Lincoln speaking, I would save the Union. I would save it in the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be to the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless it could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there are those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help save the Union. I shall do less when I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more when I shall believe it will help the cause. So Lincoln makes it very clear. The war is not about slavery. It was clear from his earlier statements in his first inaugural address. It's clear he's trying to clear black people out of the United States. And now he's written a letter to the editor, published in a major paper, saying, hey, this war is not about slavery. I don't care what happens about slavery. The war is about saving the Union. And Lincoln misunderstood the Constitution, misunderstood the status of the states, and that's why he felt the Union had to be saved. All right. Now, let's go to the Presidential Proclamation of September 22nd, 1862. This is hard to find sometimes on the internet because they don't like it, because it's got language in it that they don't like. Basically, Lincoln is stating this is a proclamation. This is actually a wartime expedient. It's extra constitutional. And he basically says, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America, and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, thereof do hereby proclaim and declare that hereafter, as heretofore, the war will be prosecuted for the object of practically restoring constitutional relationships between the United States. In other words, he's saying all along we have been fighting this war to rejoin the Union. And each of the states and the people thereof in the states, that relation is or may be suspended or disturbed. And he breaks this into two parts. He talks about states which are not in rebellion to the United States, and he talks about states that are in rebellion to the United States. As of January 1st, 1863. Okay, he set a deadline, January 1st, 1863. And he said, basically, if you are in the Union on that date and you have slaves, you can keep those slaves. We're not going to affect that. because that's the Constitution. He's a very strict constitutionalist in the sense that he doesn't understand it, except for the fact he doesn't understand the states are sovereign. And so he's saying, the Constitution says slavery is okay, and you can keep your slaves if you're in the Union, if you've rejoined the Union or not in rebellion. On the other hand, if you are in rebellion, if we capture your slaves, they're ours. Basically, we're going to no longer be your property. It says all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall then henceforth and forever be free. That's the part that people like to quote. Now, some of this language is not present in the document that's published on January 1st, 1863. And so the embarrassing part here about you can keep your slaves and stuff, that's not there because it's irrelevant. The January 1st, 1863 document is basically saying this is targeted at the states that are in rebellion. And it's basically this, by the way, is how Virginia got split. Shortly after this, in October 1862, Western Virginia had a plebiscite and decided they wanted to separate from Virginia and rejoin the Union. And so by the summer of 1863, they were a separate state. They were already occupied basically, but there were federal forces there, and it's mountains. They don't have slaves in the mountains. And so West Virginia never was motivated by the slave issue, and this became an opportunity for them to separate from the rest of Virginia, and therefore to avoid any sort of repercussions. And this is sort of a translation on my part of what Lincoln was saying. And this was as of January 1st, 1863. This is when this all went into effect. The policy stated on September 22nd, 1860 was not called an Emancipation Proclamation. That was added by historians distorting the facts to support Northern propaganda venerating Lincoln. It is hard to find the actual text of this document. Sometimes you will find the text for the January 1st, but you won't find it for the September 22nd. The principal area to defect from the Confederacy was Western Virginia. Here you have a map of Virginia as it was before the war and after the war. All right. Ironically, Lincoln's not giving up this idea of deporting all the black people. He actually, anticipating that there would be people who would be giving up slaves as of January 1st, literally on December 31st, 1862, he signed a document that allowed for a private company to deport about 5,000 slaves or freed slaves to a place called Cow Island. If you speak French, you can see that's Cow Island, which is just off the coast of Haiti, which has a very dark history of slavery. And it turns out that Lincoln was in agreement with this. He tried to commit the government to it. It turns out that Seward, his wife, was a abolitionist, and basically Seward got in there and gummed up the works, and the whole project fell through, and it was all blamed on this guy Knock, who was a German guy, and Lincoln sort of got his hands washed of it. But you can look this document up as well, and obviously Lincoln was not giving up on the idea of deporting black people. He was a white nationalist by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm going to end it there.